Carpetbaggers by Kofax. Chapter 6. The Centaurs' village wasn't very much fun in the rain, Lucy decided. The Centaurs were able to mostly ignore the weather with their sturdy hooves and thick coats, but humans had a harder time with the rain, for if they got soaked through their clothes, and while their cloaks were warm, they were not Macintoshes, they were likely to get ill. And Susan did not think it would be pleasant to be ill here in northern Narnia, where there were no houses and no chicken soup and no mothers to look after them. So while Windcaller and Strongwind went out on patrol along the border, the Pevensies huddled in the largest shed, sitting uncomfortably and damply on crates and bundles of supplies and trade goods. Sad to say, Lucy thought it was as boring a day as any at Professor Kirk's house, although she would not have said so. Even Narnia could not be all adventures all the time, after all. After playing 4 rounds of I Spy and several other games, not even Susan could be convinced to continue. Lucy sighed loudly and flapped back against a bundle of burlap-wrapped sheep fleeces, which smelled a bit strongly, but were still more comfortable than the crates or the damp floor. Peter had drawn his knife. Stormcoat had given him an obsidian blade to replace the one he had lost, and was doodling on the dirt floor. Susan was stitching up a hole in her cloak with a needle Silversharp had given her. "Oh!" said Edmund suddenly. He pulled his pack into his lap and excavated for some time, tossing aside various dirty items of clothing, which Susan greeted with a scowl, and finally unearthed a bundle wrapped in a clean but threadbare shirt. It was a book, a great large leather-bound volume like the ones on the professor's shelves, but with no gold print on the leather. The edges of the pages were shabby and uneven, and the binding looked like it had been nibbled by mice. "What's that, Ed?" asked Lucy, scooting forward to look at it more closely. He didn't look up, but flipped it open and began leafing through the pages carefully. They seemed thicker and sturdier than paper, but the ink was spotty and faded. "I found it in the castle archives, brought it along because I didn't have time to look at it there. It looked like it was—" His voice trailed off as he traced a finger along a spidery line of text. "Was what?" asked Peter. He leaned forward, but the book was upside down to him, and the writing looked handwritten in an ornate script that was hard to read even the right way up. "I thought it was a history, but it isn't really," said Edmund. "It's like, the Domesday book." Susan shook her head, but Peter nodded. Lucy didn't like the sound of it. Nothing fun could be written in a book with a name like that. "It was a record of property, wasn't it?" said Peter. "After the Battle of Hastings." "Right," said Edmund. "This lists the, estates and vassals and taxes taken in all the districts in Narnia for, He flipped the front of the book and then back to the end. "The last 12 years before the winter began." "That doesn't sound very interesting," said Lucy, but Edmund shook his head. "No, it is, Lou. Look!" And he turned a few pages, scanning rapidly, and then pointed at one line. "Greentree Manor, held by Tumnus Fons, son of Tumnus of Earl Shandon of Lantern Waste, under Queen Swanwhite, in this the 13th year of her reign. 100 acres of woodland, 6 acres of pasture, 4 families of fawns as tenants. Yearly tribute of 2 cords of wood, 4 weeks of service, and 2 silver lions, received on the first day of spring." "Tumnus, son of Tumnus!" repeated Lucy, thrilled. "Was that Mr. Tumnus's father?" "Or his grandfather," said Susan. "I can imagine a line of Tumnuses stretching back to the beginning of the world." "Right." Peter stared at the book, frowning. "So this tells us who owned all the land and how it was organized. We could reinstate them if we knew who they were, or their descendants." "Assuming no one else has moved in the meantime," amended Rhea in a dry voice. Lucy jumped. She had thought Rhea was asleep, as the wolf had been curled in the entry with her tail over her nose for the last few hours. Susan nodded thoughtfully. "Good point." "Well, why should that matter?" asked Peter. "The only way they could have it now is if the witch gave it to them." Edmund shrugged and looked uncertain. "I don't know, Pete. If someone has been living on the same land for the last 90 years, it seems rather unfair to kick them off because of a change in government. Assuming they didn't do anything wrong themselves." "Pretty big assumption there, Ed," said Peter, and he looked like he was about to say something else, but then he shut his mouth instead. Edmund flushed a little, but met Peter's eyes as though he knew what Peter was going to say. Rhea yawned and stretched, and Lucy looked over at her and at the open ground outside. It was still raining, as it had been all day. 2 soggy crows sat on the edge of the fountain, looking bedraggled. One of the centaurs went by, his large hooves churning up the mud in front of the shed. Lucy sighed, but was grateful that at least it wasn't cold, just wet. When she looked back at the book, Edmund had skipped on past Tumnus's entry. Susan reached over and tugged at something half hidden under the book. "What's this, Ed?" "I forgot about that," said Edmund, and unfolded the paper to reveal a large map in multicolored, if faded, inks. "Oh, how beautiful!" said Lucy, and it was. She squeezed in next to Edmund so she could see it right side up. "This is much better than the ones the dwarfs had," said Susan. "Look, Peter, it even has the giants' castles north of the border." "Ah, more," said Peter, scanning the outside edges of the map. He read the names out loud. "Redilia, Telmar, Arkinland, Kalaman, Tedabinthia, Durn, Galma. By the lion, we're surrounded! And look, there are cities in those places. Do we know who lives there? Are there humans? Or more talking animals, or fauns and dwarves? Are they friendly?" Susan nodded, tracing the southern border of Narnia where it wove through the mountains. "And were they friendly with the witch? If they were, they might not be friendly with us." "Well, that's an uncomfortable thought," said Edmund. Lucy didn't like that idea either. The cloth draped over the opening to the shed flapped in the rising wind, and when Lucy looked up she saw one of the bedraggled crows hunched stolidly in the edge of their shelter. It turned its head when she looked at it, shrugged its wings, and sunk its head, muttering. "Look here," said Peter, pointing back at the map. "If we follow the river here and then cut west, we can come out just north of Lantern Waste, not far from the witch's castle. I think we need to take a look there. Could be a century's worth of, well, just about anything inside." Susan nodded slowly. Lucy liked the idea. They could visit Mr. Tumnus. But Edmund just frowned down at the map and didn't say anything. "Ed?" Peter asked, his voice softer than it used to be when he talked to Edmund. Edmund didn't look up, but after a moment he shrugged and said, "It's a good idea. We should do it." And then he got up and went out of the shed into the rain. The crow, startled, flew off as well, circling twice about the fountain before disappearing into the gray and misty day. Once the decision was made, they didn't wait around on it. Before dawn the next day, which was, thankfully, clear and sunny, they arose and arranged their packs. In addition to everything the dwarves had given her, Lucy had to add a short bow and arrows made from wood provided by the dryads, and a green woolen jerkin embroidered with small gold lions along the bottom. The other also had new jerkins, although it was too warm to wear them. They set out after a hearty breakfast, and many farewells from Stormcoat, Silversharp, and Windcaller, and headed south along the stream. Rhea ranged well ahead of them, circling back now and again to make sure the children were following her lead. They walked for a long time, following narrow game trails through the piney woods, stepping on red-brown needles and soft dirt. Birdsong accompanied them. Cheeps and chirps and long trills, and a striking black and white bird with a yellow bill followed them for some time, chattering occasionally and staring at Lucy. When they stopped to eat cheese sandwiches Strongwind had given them, Lucy thought the sheep cheese was too sharp. Lucy tossed a bit of her bread to the bird. It picked it up, but refused to come any closer. "Is that a talking bird, Rhea?" asked Lucy, pointing to the bird. Rhea cocked her head sideways. The bird jumped backwards. "Oh, a magpie. Some of them do talk, Queen, although many don't. It's hard to tell." "Really?" asked Edmund, looking up from the book he'd barely put down since yesterday. "That could be rather useful." "Oh?" said Susan, and then her tone changed completely. "Peter, look!" Lucy followed where she was pointing. They were seated on a rocky promontory, and Susan pointed at a shrub just a dozen feet away on the edge of this small open space. It was nothing much, just a small bush, but some of the wide glossy leaves on it were a brilliant shade of red. "What do you—" "Oh," Peter sounded unsurprised. "Well, do you think people know?" "Know what?" asked Lucy. "That the summer's ending," said Edmund. He looked up at the cloudless sky, his face bleak. In the late afternoon, the game trail petered out in a great meadow. They had come over a ridge and down the other side, and then up and over another, and now they were in a much broader valley, with a river meandering across the middle of it, and very few trees. A flock of birds, ducks maybe, although they had bright green heads and yellow wings, burst up from the river and winged away southward. The grass about them was knee-high, brilliant green, with heavy nodding heads full of seeds. Edmund picked some and fingered it thoughtfully. "Look," said Peter, pointing down the valley. "What's that?" There were buildings down there clustered together, barely discernible against the hillside behind them. Rhea flicked an ear.
Probably Wiggles, she said. Fishing the river. You should meet them, she added with an amused curl of her tongue. You'll like them. They're different.
Different was the word for it, Lucy decided. Wiggles, river Wiggles to be precise, were tall, skinny people with mud-colored skin and webbed hands and feet. Their hair hung loosely under flappy hats, and they wore no boots. Their dwellings were only mud huts thatched with straw, but they had built an elaborate series of docks along the water's edge, to which were tied a number of small watercraft. Out in the river, many sticks and logs stood up out of the water, and Rhea said that was a fishing weir.
"Oh, aye,"
said the Chief Wiggle, a tall man. Lucy thought he was a man, but she wasn't completely sure. By the name of Reed Buller.
"We seeded those fields as soon as the snow was off them. But the effort was wasted, for sure the winter's hard upon us. We'll have snow in the week, or maybe a hurricane. The grain will all mold or rust, and we'll be starving by the spring."
"You think?" asked Peter doubtfully. "I expect you've got some time yet." Reed Buller looked at Peter with a smile that made Lucy think of the day that she had tried to teach Mrs. Jenkins' cat to come when it was called.
"Oh, it's nice to see Aslan's kings and queens are so full of optimism. The castle will be a place of cheer, I'm thinking, if the hurricanes don't flood it."
So you know who we are? Susan asked. I don't remember seeing you at the battle.
Reed Buller shook his head, which made the long lobes of his ears wobble. Lucy bit her lip so she wouldn't giggle. It wasn't polite.
"Wiggles make for poor soldiers, Queen. But we hear what there is to hear from the dryads and the river spirits. All of Western Narnia has heard the stories now of your defeat of an army of giants, and how you pulled the dwarves of Pattering Hill up out of the endless pit after the mine collapsed. It's an honor to have you visit our sad little village, although I'm embarrassed to say that all we have for you is fish and pouring off a dot. It'll likely make you sick."
Far from being poor fish, dinner was marvelous. Freshly caught trout, or something similar, fried up with butter and greens and served piping hot. They hadn't enough forks to go around, and Edmund ate his with a spoon, but there were no complaints. Even Rhea seemed to enjoy her meal, and she generally preferred her meat much less dead and preferably bloody. Reed Buller and his wife Greenpool also offered them fried potatoes, explaining that the seed potatoes had been planted before the winter and had matured with Aslan's summer, just as if no time had passed at all. "What other news have you?" asked Peter after the dishes had been scrubbed with sand and rinsed in the river, and Reed Buller had lit a pipe which smelled so horribly Lucy and Susan had to move upwind. There was a hint of chill in the air, but the stars were out and the wind had died, so they sat around the fire in their centaur jerkins, and Lucy felt very comfortable and happy indeed. Greenpool looked up from her knitting, raising her eyebrows. Wiggle women look much the same as Wiggle men, except their hair is longer, bound in thick braids with green ribbons, and their hats have no brims.
"Nose King! Little enough. I'm sure we'll be at war right soon between the giants and the Telmarines, and even the Archenlanders. King Cole's sons haven't forgotten their history. But the dryads say the deer of the western foothills are fighting over grazing territory, and giants have killed dozens of centaurs in the north reaches. And the dwarves of Pattering Hill are near to blows with the red dwarves of Yellow Bluff over the rights to a copper mine west of Carpetbaggers."
"That is more news than we have had for some weeks, Mistress Greenpool," protested Peter, and bowed to her from his seat next to the fire. He should have looked silly, but Lucy thought he looked polite. Reed Buller shook his pipe out, looked mournfully into a little pouch at his belt, and then tucked the pipe away.
"Aye, but there's more. Ugly whisperings about treasure and revenge, and some folks swearing violence to get their own back."
A harsh voice broke in.
"That's not ugly whispers, Wiggle. That's plain thievery."
Edmund and Peter both started up, Edmund drawing his sword. "Who's that?" snapped Edmund, and for the first time Lucy thought he sounded like a king and not just her brother. But they had been facing the fire, and their night vision was poor, and it took some time before Lucy could see the heavily shouldered figure shuffling out of the shadows. It was a badger, Lucy saw finally, with a grizzled muzzle and a limp.
"No need to go skulking around a fire in the darkness, Redclaw," said Greenpool mildly. "We'd have been happy to have you for dinner, as you all know."
Edmund stepped back a pace, making room for the badger to approach the fire. He didn't lower his sword, though.
"That says beep, ma'am," said the badger as he moved forward. "But I was in Lantern Waste at noon yesterday, and it's a long climb up from there. I've not even been home to dandle my own cats."
He ignored Edmund completely.
Then sit you down and we'll try to feed you, although likely it'll be cold and smelly,
said Greenpool with a look at Reed Buller. He put down his mug and went off into the darkness straight away. Lucy decided she liked Greenpool a great deal. She wasn't sure about Broadclaw, though. After peeking sideways at his feet, she decided the name fit a bit too well. "Sit down, Ed," said Peter, and Edmund sheathed his sword at last. "What do you mean there, about thievery?" Peter asked Broadclaw. "What have you heard?" Greenpool poured a mug of ale for Broadclaw, and he took it in his two front paws and drank it straight off, just like the men in the Black Swan at home in Finchley. Lucy put her hand over her mouth and felt Susan shake beside her as she stifled a giggle.
"Heard? Seen more like,"
the Badger answered, though his voice wasn't as sharp as it had been.
"Badgers remember more than we ought, maybe, but we're not fools, not like some who'll grab what they can, thinking the lion's looking the other way now."
Edmund looked up sharply at that and then leaned over to whisper something to Susan that Lucy couldn't hear. Susan nodded, frowning. Peter ignored all of that, keeping his attention on Broadclaw. "Are there a lot of them, these people who were taking advantage? Or do most people trust in Aslan?" Reed Puller was back now, and the smell of fish frying in the pan was almost enough to make Lucy hungry all over again. It had been a long day of hiking, after all. But Broadclaw ignored the food and looked straight at Peter.
"It's not a matter of trust in the lion, boy, is it? It's a question of power. With the witch gone, well, there's plenty who'd have been happy to sit on her seat cold as it was. Now they've got their chance. What are you going to do about it?"
The cold water wasn't helping his feet much. Edmund pulled one foot out of the river and looked at it skeptically. "Blast!" he said quietly. It was early yet, and he didn't want to wake anyone. "Ed, what are you doing?" Peter's footsteps echoed strangely on the wooden planks of the dock. The early mist was rising off the river, and the water was very still but for the ripples where an occasional fish jumped. Somewhere upstream a sleepy duck quacked. Edmund didn't answer his brother, merely held up his foot so Peter could see the raw chafed spots on his instep and heel. "Ouch!" said Peter sympathetically and squatted down next to him, one hand on Edmund's shoulder. "That from your boots? I wondered why you were at the back of the line yesterday." "They're too small," explained Edmund. He dropped his foot back into the water with a sigh. Peter stared at him critically for a long moment. Edmund shifted, uneasy. But Peter grinned. "I think you're taller too. Narnia agrees with you." Edmund couldn't help the flush of pride that gave him, but his mind quickly returned to the problem at hand. "But my boots are still too small, and I don't think the Wiggles know anything about shoemaking." "Good point," said Peter, snorting. He stared across the river, eyes unfocusing in thought, and didn't say anything for a while. Edmund's feet began to get cold. More birds began to call from the trees on the other side of the river, and in the bushes along the riverbank upstream. When Peter spoke again, he didn't look at Edmund. "Are you going to be all right? If we go to her castle, if we go to her castle." Edmund had avoided thinking about the witch for the last few weeks. It had not been very difficult. Everything they were doing was about moving forward, about building ties within Narnia and binding Narnians to Cair Paravel. But Peter's question put him right back in that cell again. Worse, it reminded him of the moment he had so stupidly said Tumnus's name to the witch. The fawn could be dead now. Indeed, they all would be dead now. Because of him. He had Aslan to thank for preventing that and for killing the witch. Edmund made himself remember the sound her wand had made when he broke it, and the way she had looked so small and crumpled on the ground after the battle was over. Oh yes, it had been nasty, but Edmund had forced himself to see her body to make sure she was truly dead. Susan had gone with him, and neither of them had spoken of it again. Aslan had saved him, had saved all of them, had done it by going willingly to the witch. "It's just a castle," he said finally, and looked at Peter. Peter nodded. "Let's go see Lucy about your feet," he said and stood up. "And we'll keep watch for a cobbler's shop." Peter's obsidian knife was sharp enough to cut through the toes of Edmund's boots. It was the only solution they could come up with, and they had at least another day to travel before they reached Lantern Waste. Lucy was nearly beside herself with excitement over seeing Tumnus again, although Edmund did wonder how happy the fawn would be to see her. He did, after all, leave Cair Paravel without even saying goodbye. In the end, they did not leave the River Wiggles village until afternoon. They had lingered over breakfast, and then Peter had insisted on practicing swordplay with Edmund, and Lucy had demanded knife lessons from Reed Buller, which made her brothers nervous.
But I'd rather she can defend herself,
said Susan, and given how easily the Dryads had snatched her away, Edmund had to agree. They walked all afternoon, mostly downhill, along narrow trails and through broad meadows, slowly descending from the northern hills into the wide and rolling country on either side of the North Fork of the great river. Twice they saw people working in fields in the distance, fauns and dwarves, and once a group of very thin and tiny people who appeared to have wings. Lucy kept looking back at them as Rhea urged them on. Around mid-afternoon, the river took a sharp turn southward and dropped into a narrower channel. The ground grew rough and the trail swung away from the river, taking them into the hills above what was now clearly a gorge. The river surged between those narrow rocky walls, throwing up great white spumes of water, and Edmund looked down from above, wondering if the Wiggles ever took their boats down this.
"River's higher than I've ever seen it,"
said Rhea, coming up next to Edmund.
"All that snow melt."
Edmund looked down at the river, thinking of the village near the fords at Baruda. That was miles and miles away, of course, far downstream. "Will there be flooding, do you think?" he asked.
"Sure to be,"
she said, and laid her ears back.
100 years of snow, King. The floods at Pattering Hill were just the beginning, I expect."
The water would rise and keep rising, and there would be no sandbags, no levees to block it. The crops in the fields, freshly planted after the thaw, would be swept away. And so would some of the people who couldn't run fast enough or climb high enough. Houses would be destroyed, lives lost. Edmund swallowed. How could Aslan allow this? I don't think he does, said Lucy. She looked down into the gorge with her arms folded across her chest, but the expression on her face was that of someone much older than 9. I think it's just natural. This is what happens when snow melts. And Aslan can't magic that away, or maybe he shouldn't. After all, he couldn't come into Narnia until we'd been here first, and he couldn't magic the White Witch away either, no matter how much he wanted to. I think the flooding is like that. It's just what happens, said Edmund doubtfully, and Lucy nodded. Well, it's bloody awful, he snapped. Is there anything we could do? Can we send messages downstream to warn them? Rhea cocked her head, one ear flapping over sideways.
Certainly, she said. We'll do it when we camp.
They camped on a rise above the canyon, close enough to hear the river's roar below. While Edmund built a fire, and Peter criticized, Lucy went off to talk to the trees, this time accompanied by Susan. They came back a short time later, but Susan shrugged when Edmund looked up.
No new news, just the same ridiculous stories, she said.
She sat down and poked at the fire with a stake. The sun was setting behind the hill to the west, setting the sky afire in purples and reds. Edmund had never before seen sunsets like the ones in Narnia. Nor sunrises either, but in England he had always done his best to sleep until noon when he could. Narnian mornings he wanted to be awake for. Well, it's good to know the Narnian Gossip Network is alive, remarked Peter, pulling his jerkin on as the evening chill set in. How do we send a message, though? We could tell the Dryads, but it's sure to get gobbled within 3 miles.
Easy enough,
said Rhea around a mouthful of feathers. With a swing of her head, she tossed a fat bird to Edmund, who caught it defensively. It was still warm. He plucked a feather while Rhea turned around and said to a nearby tree, Are you going to just follow us around or be useful? A black and white bird popped out of the leaves at that, bouncing forward along a branch until the limb drooped gently with the bird's weight at the end. Fine, then, said the bird in a harsher voice than Edmund had expected for a bird of that size. What do you want? To send a message to Baruna, said Peter after a moment. Warn them about the flooding.
The magpie fluffed its feathers and said,
And what's in it for me, then? Flying all the way down there, dodging eagles and harpies and lion knows what?
Rhea said with a hint of a growl in her voice.
Service to your kings and queens, Coven, and to your people, unless you'd prefer that the valley villages be lost, thinking of good eating afterwards.
None of that, bitch!
Snapped the magpie with an angry flutter of his wings.
I'm not a vulture. I'm a good Narnian, and don't you ever say otherwise.
Then you'll go, asked Edmund, unfortunately aware of the dead bird in his hands. It seemed strange to be talking to one bird and getting ready to eat another one. It's really important.
Corvin flicked his tail irritably. Fine, fine, fine. I'll go. Flood's coming, get out of the plane, that sort of thing. All right, then I'm off.
And he sprang into the air, disappearing above the trees before anyone had a chance to speak.
He'll get it right, won't he?
Lucy asked Rhea.
He won't forget.
Rhea shook her head and sat down to scratch. He'll be fine. Magpies were the traditional messengers for the royal house of Narnia, or so my mother told me once. He'll be lording it over the other birds before long. Well, good, said Edmund, and then looked down at the bird Rhea had brought them. So, does anyone want to help block this? Around mid-morning, they climbed a last difficult rise, bushwhacking through dense growth that tore at their clothes, and came out on a rocky promontory with a clear view to the west. By George, look at that! Burst out Peter, and Edmund had to agree. So close and clear that Edmund thought he should be able to touch them with the western mountains, their tops trailing cloudy banners. They looked like an impenetrable barrier, but peering close, Edmund saw a few breaks in the line that might be high passes. What's on the other side, Rhea? Asked Susan after a long moment. Other side of what? Rhea said, not looking up from the stone she was sniffing around. Edmund raised his eyebrows. The mountains, of course! Rhea did look up at that, flicked an ear, and then went back to her stone. I can't see them, but if you mean the western mountains, so far as I know, it's more mountains. Off country mostly, although there's a pass in the southwest that will take you to Talmar. Not sure why anyone would want to go to Talmar, but there you go. You can't see the mountains? Edmund repeated, momentarily forgetting questions of geography. I have a nose, King. Aslan did not see fit to give me a human's eyes as well. And there was no real answer to that. From this point, their path was almost all downhill, scrambling down rocky hillsides and narrow, treacherous game trails, until they came at last down into more open country, and Edmund began to recognize the shape of the hills around them. We're in Lantern Waste, he said with some pride. Tumnus's cave was only an hour or so away now, and after stopping for a quick meal, greasy cold grouse wrapped in the last of their clothing from England, Edmund suspected it was Peter's shirt. They struck out across the broad valley. They were about to ford a narrow creek when the wind shifted, and Edmund smelled smoke. Rhea's hackles went up, and she said, Quiet, in a fierce but low voice before she moved off upstream, nose in the air to follow the scent. Motioning the rest of them to stay in cover where they were, Peter followed Rhea carefully, his unsheathed sword in one hand. The two of them disappeared into the trees within moments. Edmund stayed with his sisters, holding his sword, and wished furiously for a shield, or better get an army. He felt exposed. Here on the creek side, Susan strung her bow and took 3 arrows in her left hand, ready to draw. They waited, listening to the wind in the treetops. Edmund suddenly remembered Beaver saying that some of the trees are hers, you know. He glanced around uncertainly. If there were still supporters of the witch in Narnia here in Lantern Waste, so close to her castle, was a likely place to find them. It was some time before Peter came back, walking cautiously but not as silently as he had left. He had returned Reendon to its sheath on his back. His face was somber. What is it? Edmund demanded, jittery from the long and frightening wait. Murder, said Peter shortly. Someone set fire to a grove of beeches and killed... Well, we couldn't tell. Maybe a beaver, Ray thinks. There wasn't anything left, but there was a lot of blood. Lucy gasped. Not the beavers! Oh, Peter! Not the beavers we know, Lou, said Peter. Rhea said there used to be beavers on every stream or creek in all of western Narnia, and we're an hour or more from Mr. Beaver's lodge. Which didn't make it any better, Edmund thought, that it was a stranger to them who had died. Was this war ever going to be over? Edmund sheathed his sword, but kept his hand locked on the pommel. They must have left a trail. We could follow them. But Peter shook his head. Rhea smelled harpies. They're long gone. Must have been done yesterday. The fire's mostly cold now. Rhea came back then, slinking along silently, her coat abristle and her ears constantly in motion. She didn't say anything, not that there was anything to say, and they set off again. This time they walked very quietly, staying in cover and trying not to leave footprints. It was a slow and trying afternoon. They were all jumpy and hungry when they finally came within sight of Tumnus's cave. Lucy leapt into Tumnus's arms as soon as he opened the door to Peter's knock, and he appeared to be just as happy to see her, although Edmund noted that he was less enthusiastic about Rhea's presence. To be fair, the fawn had been captured by Rhea's littermate Mulgrim, and badly treated as a result. Tumnus's cave seemed almost fully restored to its previous state, although Edmund had only seen it once, with a new door, freshly painted, and some comfortable chairs arranged around a briskly burning fire. "Well, now that we're settled," said Tumnus as he poured the tea, which was in fact rosehip tea, for Tumnus had long since run out of proper tea. "Do tell me what you've been up to. There are so many stories going around, and they simply cannot all be true." Peter opened his mouth, hesitated, and then closed it again. Edmund shrugged. There was too much to tell, and he looked at Susan instead. Susan took her tea, put a lump of sugar in it, and said serenely,
"We've been traveling around the countryside, meeting people, and solving problems where we can." "And we met dryads," said Lucy in between bites of buttered toast. "Dryads and centaurs and wiggles, and a budget too," she added somewhat more doubtfully. "It's been ever so much fun, although this is lovely too."
And she looked around Tumnus's cozy little cave with its trinkets and books and aging but still sound furniture. Edmund looked too, and for the first time it occurred to him that Tumnus had tea and toast, and the beavers had had a ham in their lodge, and yet the dwarves at Powdering Hill had been living on dried fish, seaweed, and goat milk for the last 100 years. He opened his mouth to say something, looked at Lucy's tearful face, and decided to bring it up later, preferably with Rhea or Susan. The conversation had gone on while Edmund wondered about inequities of income, to quote his Aunt Alberta, which would have disgusted Peter no end, although in this instance Edmund was pretty sure Alberta was on the mark. And now Peter was talking. "Thought we would visit the witch's castle tomorrow. There must be loads of supplies there that we can use to help people out now that the winter is over." Tumnus dropped his toast. It landed butter side down on the carpet, and Tumnus spent quite an unnecessary amount of time picking it up and brushing crumbs off his chair before he looked back at Peter. His voice was strained and nervous as he said, "But King Peter, you mustn't! You really mustn't go to the castle! Oh no, it won't do at all!" There was a bit of silence then, as everyone looked at Tumnus. He flushed quite fiercely, even his chest coloring a bit. "Well, you see, there is someone already living at the witch's castle. Several someones. And I don't think they would be at all pleased to see you, to be perfectly honest." Of course, Susan thought. Why hadn't she expected it? A castle was enormously valuable. Just think of all the battles in England over various castles, after all. And the witch's castle, she and her siblings could never have been the first people to think there might be something valuable in it. "This is what Broadclaw meant, isn't it?" said Peter, and Edmund nodded. Susan put her tea down on the tray.
"Who are they, Mr. Tumnus? The people in the castle?"
Tumnus looked at her miserably, as if he were somehow responsible. "They call themselves the West Narnian Patrol, Queen Susan. They moved in, weeks ago, before I came back from Cair Paravel. They might have moved in as soon as—" He blanched a little, recovered, and went on. "As soon as Aslan freed those of us the witch had turned to stone."
"The Western Narnian Patrol," repeated Lucy, wonderingly. "It sounds like they're in the Guides or Gurkhas."
"I don't know what you mean, Queen Lucy, but they are not nice people." Tumnus looked down and picked at a scratch on the table. "So who are they?" Peter repeated Susan's question with an edge in his voice. "Are they the witch's followers? Ogres? Hags? Harpies?" "Wolves?" thought Susan with a glance at Rhea. She was sitting by the half-open door, her attention apparently on the evening outside, but Susan was certain she was hearing every word. No, nothing like that," protested Tumnus. "They're all ordinary Narnians. They are mostly talking animals, 2 or 3 holly dryads, some dwarves, a stag, and an owl, I think, and the bear, of course. Bruno, of course," said Edmund in such a dry voice Susan nearly laughed. "Bruno is in charge, if anyone is, although I don't think they're very organized. It's not like Aslan's army was, you know."
"Well, if they're ordinary Narnians, why won't they want to see us?"
asked Lucy, not for the first time, cutting through to the heart of the matter. Susan wondered if Lucy had any idea how unusual that was. Tumnus, however, didn't really have an answer. He hemmed a bit and fumbled with his teacup. Only after a long, uncomfortable moment did Susan take pity on him.
They don't want to see us, Lucy, because we are a threat to them. They have a castle, after all, with whatever treasure or valuables the witch had inside, and they won't want to share it with anyone.
Much less a group of children imported from another world to be their rulers, she added silently, not for the first time wondering about Aslan's purposes in doing so. If Lucy was right, the deep magic had demanded the presence of human children in Narnia to break the witch's power and allow Aslan to defeat her. But why then put those same children on the throne, for pity's sake? They were doing their best, but honestly, it was more than a little ridiculous. Peter got up and wandered over to the bookshelves. He was, Susan had noticed, much more restless than he used to be. He would now seldom sit when he could stand, or stand when he could walk. He paced now, taking long strides back and forth across the worn carpets covering the stone floors. "I don't like it," he said, and Susan smiled. He glanced up, saw her face, and shrugged in sheepish acknowledgement, and then continued, speaking slowly and thoughtfully. "It's not just this Western Narnian patrol, and you'll have to tell me if they really are patrolling anything. It's also that murder last night, and what Broglaw said. I would have expected the area closest to the witch's castle to be the most loyal to Aslan, the most likely to rally around us. But it's not like that, Tumnus, is it?" "Indeed, my king, it is not," said Tumnus into his lap. "I am ashamed to say that there are some Narnians who believe the humans have no place in Narnia, no matter what the prophecies say, or the histories. They blame the last human queen for Narnia falling to the White Witch, although I suspect the witch in fact killed poor Queen Swanwhite. And of course the witch also claimed she was human, and that gave her the right to the throne. There is a great deal of resentment. Not that I agree with any of it," he said hastily, looking around at them.
"What are they doing then in the castle?" asked Susan. "Are they capturing people, claiming taxes, causing trouble, or just squatting there?"
"It's not the most comfortable place," noted Edmund quietly. "Not a great spot for a holiday." Peter nodded, toying with a stone knife at his belt. "Oh, what about that murder? Tumnus, someone killed a beaver about 5 miles northeast of here, above Little Raven Creek. We think it was harpies, but they also set fire to a birch grove, and that could have killed some giants too. Would that have been this patrol, or someone else?" "Harpies?" Tumnus's ruddy face went pale. "Oh, no, the patrol is... No, I don't think they would have anything to do with harpies, or any of the witch's creatures. They're claiming that they're protecting us from evil, from those of the witch's army that weren't killed or captured in the battle. They say there are thousands of them, ogres and werewolves and hags scattered all over Narnia, and the patrol is our only defense." The fire was dying. Lucy added a log and stared into the fire for a moment before looking up to say,
"But if they had been protecting Narnia, then that beaver wouldn't have died. They're not doing a very good job."
Slumped in his chair with his arms folded, Edmund might well have been asleep. "That doesn't matter, Lou. They're like those gangsters in American films. They tell you they're going to protect you, and you have to pay them for it. Except you're really just paying them to not burn your house down." Tumnus nodded, his face a mask of misery, although Susan was quite sure he didn't get the reference. "They have been going about to the Steedings and the Holts, demanding support, as they call it. Supplies, food, even labor. They recruited Sharpnose the Fox's 2 sons last week, even though they're still quite young. When Sharpnose argued with them, they broke 3 of her ribs." "I don't believe this!" Peter flung up his arms, almost slamming his hand into the carved stone ceiling of the cavern. "If all of this was going on, Tumnus, why didn't you tell us?" There was a snort of laughter from the doorway. Susan jumped, startled, as Rhea paced into the center of the room. She sniffed at Tumnus's chair, walked once around it, and settled herself next to Edmund, but she directed her words to Peter. "You forget what I told you when we met, King. Nanians are terrible at politics. They think if they avoid a situation, it will magically go away. Besides," Rhea went on with an even sharper look at Tumnus, who had drawn his feet in and was staring at her in some distress, "why should they have called you? They didn't actually believe you would do anything." Lucy swiveled around to face Rhea, looking upset. "What do you mean?" She means, said Susan bitterly, that the only people who think we are actually the kings and queens of Narnia, and not some puppets whom Aslan brought in solely to break the witch's power, are, well, us.
Oh, Queen Susan, I'm sure that's not, protested Tumnus, but his voice trailed off in the face of Peter's flat stare and Rhea's unblinking regard. His ears drooped. He stammered for a moment and then went on weakly. I'm sure many Narnians do. It's just that it's such a difficult time right now, and once things settle down... You all expected us to just disappear afterwards, didn't you? Asked Edmund, sounding strangely clinical. Aslan couldn't possibly have meant for 4 children to be in charge. We were supposed to go back where we came from. It must have been quite a shock when the stories started coming in from the dwarves and the centaurs. Tumnus twisted his hands together, the firelight flickering on the golden tips of his horns, but didn't have anything at all to say. Bloody hell! Said Peter savagely and swung his arm in a great blow, knocking 2 goblets and a book off the sideboard. The goblets rang on the floor, the sound echoing from the stone walls of the chamber. Susan leaned her head against the back of her chair and stared at the ceiling. What on earth were they going to do? Not a time, Lion, said Edmund and laughed. The sun was slanting late through the half-open doorway when Rhea stretched, yawned a yawn that curled her tongue out over her white teeth, and went to the door. She was going hunting, Susan realized, and in that moment decided that she wanted nothing better than to be out of Tumnus's stuffy little cave. She stood, slung her bow over her shoulder, and followed Rhea out into the sunlight, ignoring Peter's questioning, Susan? When Susan caught up with her at the edge of the trees, Rhea didn't say anything, just cast Susan a sideways look, snorted once, and kept on into the wood. In the end, it turned out to be much more pleasant than staying in the cave, where Peter was stalking around like an angry bear, and Edmund stared blindly into the fire. She crept along behind Rhea, arrow on the string, stepping cautiously over sticks that would crack underfoot, or stones that would roll and twist an ankle. On occasion, they would stop and Rhea would explain what they were doing, why they needed to be downwind of the meadow, or why this route here would be a good spot for a snare. Rhea, of course, couldn't tie a snare, but she knew a lot about hunting and explained things very clearly. Susan listened and watched and, she hoped, learned. When they finally turned their steps back toward Tumnus's home, Susan had 3 rabbits tied to her belt and held the grouse's feet in one hand. She had shot down the grouse on the wing under Rhea's careful direction, and was still full of prideful astonishment when Rhea, on the path ahead of her, suddenly froze. Susan stopped moving as well. It was full dark now, and she likely wouldn't have been able to find her way back without Rhea. She looked up and around, and didn't see anything. She began to ask, "What is it?" But Rhea crowded into her, forcing her back and off the trail into the brush. "Back and down," said the wolf in the softest of growls, and Susan dropped to her hands and knees and slid backwards, ending up nearly prone under a thicket of thorns. Dead leaves and twigs caught in her clothing, and she was sharply reminded of laying in the woods watching the giants' camp. Rhea crouched beside her, her dark coat making her nearly invisible in the shadowy brush. She was watching the path they had left, and so Susan did too. After a minute or two, Susan sensed movement and caught the sound of voices, too soft to make out the words. Bodies passed by along the path, darker shadows among the trees, their shapes indistinguishable. She counted them, silently, and lost track at about 12. Several more went by after that, and then the path was clear. A night bird called, and an owl answered. The sense of movement died away, and Susan and Rhea stayed where they were, waiting. Finally, Rhea stretched and stood up and led her back onto the trail. The sky above them was clear, but Susan saw the faint flicker of movement above. Rats, she assumed. She wondered if they talked, the way the wolves and badgers and beavers of Narnia did. "Who were they?" she asked Rhea quietly. Rhea wrinkled her nose in a silent snarl. "Ogres, hags, and goblins," she said. She sniffed at a spot on the trail and bristled. "They stank of blood. Someone died tonight." "I told you," said Lucy as Susan stepped in through the door. "Peter, you owe me a cheese sandwich." Lucy cast a triumphant look at Peter, who sighed tolerantly. "Next time we find either cheese or the wherewithal to make sandwiches," added Edmund from his seat by the fire where he was paging through his Domesday book.
Peter nodded to Susan as she raised her hands to show him her catch, and then frowned at Lucy. "How did you know, Lou? The season was coming, I mean."
Lucy looked puzzled and plucked at the front of her tunic. "I don't know. I just did."
The Domesday Book had to be very interesting because Edmund didn't look up, but Susan thought she saw his shoulders tighten. "I see," said Peter thoughtfully, and shrugged. Susan shrugged right back and went to get a knife to clean the game. She wasn't entirely sure she liked all the new skills Narnia was teaching them. Dinner was mostly silent. Susan and Rhea's news about the party of ogres and hags had been met with worry from Lucy and Tumnus, and pursed lips and thoughtful looks from Peter and Edmund. But Tumnus had been cheered by Susan's offering of fresh meat, and in short order all 5 of them were sitting down to braised rabbit with carrots and leeks from Tumnus's root cellar. Rhea took one of the rabbits outside for her own dinner, which Susan appreciated. There wasn't enough salt, and Susan felt strange eating an animal she had seen hopping across a meadow 2 hours before. She found herself pushing the fragile bones of the rabbit around her bowl, and finally picked out the vegetables and simply ate those. Edmund gave her a glance when she pushed her bowl away, and then fished out the meat for himself. He needed it, she decided. He was too thin. The lantern suspended above the oak table swayed, and Peter's face went from shadowed to shining and back again. But even in that uneven light, Susan found the expression on his face worryingly familiar. She glanced at Edmund and caught the glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "All right," she said, and set down her spoon. "What is it?" Lucy giggled and poked Tumnus in the shoulder. "I told you she would guess. Susan always knows." With a solemn bow, Tumnus produced a silver coin. From where, Susan wondered, and handed it to Lucy. "In payment of our wager, my queen," he murmured, and Susan nearly applauded. He was the perfect courtier. "Well, we think we have a plan," said Peter. "I think it should help us deal with both of our problems at once." "We only have 2, murmured Edmund, but stilled at a look from Susan. She turned back to Peter and raised an eyebrow. "Pray continue," she said in a soft parody of Tumnus's courtliness. Peter snorted, but pushed the soup bowls aside and began gesturing at the empty salt cellar and the butter dish. "We have the patrol, and we have the remnants of the witch's army, who have clearly collected themselves somewhere nearby, and they're causing trouble that the patrol isn't doing anything about." "Lots of trouble," Tumnus acknowledged. "People have gone missing, and the talking beasts of the forest are afraid. Even the dryads are nervous, and they never had much to worry about from the witch." Poking at the salt cellar, Lucy said, "Do we have to call them the remnants of the witch's army? It takes too long. Can't we say the black hats or the enemy, like they do in films?" It was too serious a discussion for Susan to laugh, so she put her hand over her mouth and just smiled at Lucy. But Edmund didn't laugh. Well, he started to, and then he stopped, the sound cutting off as though sliced by one of the centaur's sharp stone blades. He stared into space for a moment, his eyes narrowing, and then he nodded and clapped Lucy on the back. "Lucy, that's brilliant! We need a way to draw people together, right? And to have a clearly defined enemy. And it is awkward to refer to them as the witches' people, as if that's all they are. But they are dangerous and important, and they need a clearer name, one that defines them for everyone. So I think we should call them rebels." He grinned at Susan, flushed with triumph. She turned it over in her mind. Rebellion put them on the outside of legitimate authority, cast them as the enemy, and more importantly, put anyone fighting them on the side of right. "Edmund, you're a genius," she said, and his smile was incandescent. Peter paused, coughed, and said, "Now that we've established that, can we get back to my plan, please?" "Your plan?" protested Edmund, still grinning. "I'm the one who came up with the best bits." "Yes, right, you just like being underestimated." Peter rolled his eyes. "Well, I'm very good at it," said Edmund, and Susan laughed. No one who knew Edmund for more than a week would ever underestimate him. But then that was the point, of course. Very new Narnians knew the 4 of them and all. They talked late into the night, with the candles melting onto the scratched surface of Tumnus's dinner table. At length, Lucy fell asleep, her head cushioned on one arm on the tabletop, and Peter carried her over to a pallet against the wall. When he returned, Tumnus opened a dusty bottle of something that smelled like cherries and oak trees when he poured it into shallow wooden bowls. "It's nearly the last bottle my father put down before the winter," he said with an expression caught somewhere between pride and embarrassment.
The vines over on the south side of Greymantle Ridge all died many years ago."
Susan lifted the bowl gingerly and took a sip. It tasted of cherries and blackberries and honey and something else, something bitter and old underlying all the rest. "Oh," she said. The taste of the wine filled her mouth even after she swallowed, and lingered there, becoming smoother and richer over time. It was fuller and broader and somehow older than anything she had ever tasted, even at the party in Carpetbaggers. "It tastes like Narnia," she finally said, and Tumnus flushed, his eyes shining. "It's wonderful." "It is," conceded Peter, looking at the maps Edmund had spread on the table as if all the answers of the universe were there. "But back to the question at hand. I'm still not comfortable relying on the patrol. I admit, from what you say, Tumnus, they were in league with the witch after all." Tumnus stilled, as though Peter's words were the witch's own want. Susan began to speak, but was interrupted by Rhea. "You'd have to search a long way to find anyone who wasn't associated with a witch in some way, King." Rhea stood up from where she had been curled in front of the fire, and padded loosely over to the table. "Pour me some of that, Tumnus, would you? I'm going to need it." As Tumnus poured, Susan asked, "What do you mean, Rhea?" They all waited as Rhea lapped at the rich red wine without splashing or dribbling at all, unlike any dog Susan had ever seen drink from a bowl, and then sat back on her haunches. "I mean that I owe you an apology, King," she said, looking at Edmund. "A traitor in Narnia today is merely someone who got caught doing what we all did." There was a quiet clunk as Peter drained his bowl and set it back down on the table. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and then said, carefully, "How did everyone survive the winter? Nothing would grow, there wasn't any trade, and whatever had been put by couldn't possibly last more than a few years." It wasn't quite a question, because Susan could tell he didn't want the answer. "There must have been some trade," Susan offered, more to take that look off Peter's face than because she thought it was true, or at least it wasn't all the truth. "Black market trade, hidden from the witch, with food imported across the borders." The wolf's ears twitched in appreciation. "You are right, Queen, but the black market by itself wasn't enough, not nearly." "So what happened?" Edmund asked. Susan felt like they were in a school play, saying the lines they were required to pronounce to make the scene move onward, except it wasn't a scene they wanted to come to the end of. They didn't want the conclusions they knew were coming. "People left." Rhea lapped at the wine again and then continued. "They went west into the wilds. Hard country, but there are 4 seasons there. Some went south into Archenland, or even the desert, or southwest into Telmar. The ones who didn't leave, well, some starved." Susan took another drink of the wine, although it didn't taste so wonderful now. "And the ones who didn't starve?" Tumnus had been staring down at the table, gripping the edge of it as though it kept him from flying off into the darkness outside. "The witch had supplies, you see," he said to the table, "and people were hungry. And at the beginning she didn't ask for so very much." There was a silence that went on for too long. Finally, Edmund said, "The beavers had a ham and a sewing machine." Rhea nodded, and something in the way she was sitting made Susan think she was keeping her hackles down by force of will. "Nearly everyone, my kings and queen. At one time or another, nearly everyone took food or other supplies from the witch." "In exchange for what?" asked Susan, her mouth dry. White teeth flashed as Rhea turned away to bite at something on her flank. "What did Jadis want? Names, service, errands. The dwarves dug ore for her, the centaurs fought her wars, the beavers brought her wood and built her furniture." And Tumnus had very nearly brought her Lucy. But he hadn't, of course, Susan reminded herself, and he had suffered for it terribly. For that she would always be grateful. She reached across the table and took his hand. His breath caught, and he squeezed her hand tightly in response, eyes shining. "But the beavers," said Peter. "Oh, King," said Rhea, with such patient affection in her voice it brought tears to Susan's eyes. "Nanians who were all good, who were too pure to have anything to do with the witch.
They died, my king.
The magpies were annoying. Chatterboxes, all of them, swarming and swirling around Peter and Susan until finally Peter put his fingers to his lips and gave the shrill whistle his father had taught him. The magpies, startled, bursting upwards in a storm of black and white feathers, and then under his eyes settled slowly down until they clustered on the branches and boulders of the small clearing outside Tumnus's cave. I'm told that the magpies are the traditional royal messengers of Narnia.
Oh, that's fine, all right,
said one of them, a bedraggled older male with only half a tail.
We carried the king's and queen's words all across Narnia, and my great-granddad, he even went to government once. We're the messengers.
I have a job for you, then, said Peter, and tried to fix each one of them with his gaze, hoping that they could be trusted inasmuch as anyone could be. No one is perfectly clean, King, said Rhea's voice in his mind. He took out the paper he had labored over with Tumnus and Ed all morning, the list of names from the battle with the witch. Some of them, at least, must be nearby, and some of them would surely come when he called. They had followed him into battle once before, hadn't they? This is different. Aslan's not here. Susan stirred beside him as he hesitated, and she spoke before he could summon the right words. This is the message that we charge you to carry. The White Witch's forces have committed murder and arson at Lantern Waste, in defiance of the will of Aslan. Your kings and queens are raising a force to drive these rebels out of Narnia for good. Protect your families, your friends, and your country. Gather at the ford of White Pines and bring your arms. You are so charged, she concluded, her voice firm as she met the eyes of each of the magpies. In the name of Aslan, son of the Emperor over the sea. When Susan had finished, the magpies fluttered their wings and muttered, Do you need it repeated? She asked sharply, but the eldest bobbed in his place and said,
No, we have it, Queen.
Good. She turned and nodded to Peter, who lifted the paper and began to read. Carry this word to the beavers of Beaver's Dam on the Great River, the 3 goats of Red Hill, Norsa the panther, Spearfast the centaur and her sons, Fleeterswind the cheetah. It wasn't a lot of names. They didn't have enough time to raise anywhere near as large an army as had fought the witch. It just needed to be large enough to do the job. When he was done, he looked up at the magpies. Well, do you know where you're going? Fly straight and safely then. And they were gone in a rush, leaving behind a quiet clearing in the midday sun and a few stray feathers. How long do you think? Susan asked as they turned back towards the cave. Yesterday's sunshine had given way to a cooler day, with fast-moving clouds and gusts of wind that rattled the limbs of the pines. Peter hoped it didn't portend a storm. Peter shrugged. The closest ones may come today. The rest, maybe tomorrow or the day after. You and Ed should probably head out this afternoon to get ready for them. The others were performing their own tasks while Peter and Susan met with the magpies, but the kettle on the stove was still hot. Peter poured the tea while Susan began sorting through gear. Can I wear this then? She asked and shook out Peter's leather jerkin with a laugh. It was too large for her, but she had nothing similar, no armor at all. He would rather go without himself than see her so unprotected. I think you should, he said, and smiled at her, but it was strained. But not your sword, she said, half joking, and Peter barked a laugh. Time crawled by. Peter drank 3 cups of rose-hip tea, made up piles of equipment for each of them from their own supplies and a cache of ancient arms they found in a chest at the back of Tumnus's storeroom, and rehearsed Susan on the strengths and weaknesses of Narnian archery. I ain't waiting! He finally burst out and leapt up to go to the door again. What's taking him so long? Susan looked up from the map she was studying. They had been trying to determine just where the rebels were gathered. It had to be a large enough open space for the harpies to get into the air, and the ogres to keep from fighting one another, with access to water. And not too many dryads nearby. The patrol won't hurt him, she said calmly, although Peter saw the line between her eyebrows that marked some concern. He's too valuable. So they could keep him as a hostage! Edmund, captive again in that castle. It was just one of Peter's nightmares. Not if they honestly see the rebels as a threat, Susan pointed out and sat back from the map, giving him her full attention. Some of them must have been at the battle. We must realize how useful we and Aslan's backing can be. And they can't be all bad, can they? Or they'd be out with the rebels.
But we're a threat to them too. You heard what Tumnus said. Why had Peter agreed to this plan? He ignored the fact that he and Edmund had come up with most of it. She sighed, looking at him with affectionate frustration. She tapped on the table with the dagger she had been using as a map pointer.
But we're also a tool. Let them think they're using us. It's what we want them to do. And Peter, trust us to do our jobs.
He laughed suddenly, staring at his cautious, well-behaved sister sitting in a cave with a naked blade in her hand. What? She asked. He folded his arms and stared back at her. She wore tall boots with breeches and a green woolen jerkin over a worn tunic. She looked like a pirate queen from the days of old, not a 14-year-old schoolgirl. You wouldn't have said that 2 months ago. She raised an eyebrow, glanced down at the knife in her hand, and flipped it suddenly so it spun in the air and then landed with a solid thump back in her hand. Lucy wasn't the only one who got knife lessons from a reed puller.
No, I suppose I wouldn't have.
Peter grinned and then looked outside again. No sign of them. He was just no good at standing around.
You should go now,
Susan said from behind him and put a hand on his arm.
Someone needs to confirm that...
She waved back at the table where the maps lay weighted down by Tumnus's family silver.
And I can send Rhea after you when she comes back. You'll go mad waiting here.
He caught his breath. The prospect of striking out across the Narnian countryside, fording streams and climbing hills completely alone for the very first time since they had stumbled through the wardrobe.
It was impossibly tempting.
And they did need the intelligence. Susan didn't say anything more, just watched his face as he balanced his desperate need to move with an instinctive caution. He was the High King. He wasn't supposed to put himself in danger. Except he was the High King. If he didn't put himself at risk, how could he ask anyone else to? And with that, the decision was made. All right, he said, and went to the side of the parlor where they had piled all their equipment. He quickly picked out his pack, added a water skin, the last of the dried mutton from the centaurs, and some writing material stolen from Edmund. His cloak was too bright. He traded the scarlet for a weathered green one and slid a stone dagger Stormcoat had given him into his boot. He hugged Susan at the doorway, feeling ridiculously like a character in a film. The knife had her waist dug into his ribs, and she laughed before drawing his head down and kissing him on the forehead. She looked like she was going to say something serious, and then dimpled and just said, "Don't get lost, Pete." He snorted, clapping her on the shoulder like he would have Edmund. "Make sure you send Rhea on as soon as they return. I want to know exactly what they said." And he turned and jogged away into the wood, feeling more than anything else like it was his first day at a new school, or the first time he took the train alone. His veins felt like they were buzzing with soda water. The wind fluttered the edge of his cloak, and a crow cried out far overhead as he struck out northwest, following the winding route of White Rush Creek. But Peter's quick scouting expedition turned into something rather more dangerous when, after successfully locating the rebels' camp and getting a rough head count of their forces, too close and too many, in that order, Peter picked up a follower on the way back to Tumnus's cave. Rhea hadn't found him. He forced himself to assume it was for legitimate, non-worrisome reasons. But it made things more difficult, since without her nose and ears, he was having a hard time determining what exactly it was that was following him. It was also darkening rapidly. He had a suspicion the days were getting shorter, although without a watch he couldn't be sure. He couldn't remember where his watch was. He thought maybe he'd left it in Carpetbaggers and had a mental image of it sitting on the chest in the girls' room where they'd left most of their English clothes. It was colder than it had been this morning, and the scudding clouds had become a solid ceiling of light and dark gray. It was going to rain. Susan would be unhappy about fighting a battle in the mud. This would be the third time he had tried to catch whatever it was that was following him. The first 2 times it had slipped away. Around or past him, he wasn't sure, and he couldn't risk going any further with it on his trail. He suspected he could probably lose it if he cut west into the steep and unforgiving canyons leading up into the mountains, but he was also sure that if he did, he would lose himself as well. So he had to handle it now before he led it, whatever it was, right back to his siblings. This time he decided he'd go for a classic. If it had worked for Robin Hood, it should work for King Peter, right? and had found himself a great oak with broad, spreading limbs. After laying an obvious track down to the creek's edge, he backtracked cautiously and scaled the tree, ending up crouched against the trunk on a branch that had seemed much wider when viewed from the safety of the ground. It occurred to him, as he waited in the growing gloom and growing discomfort, that this would be a damn foolish move if it was a cat that was tracking him. He shifted his weight, realized how hard it would be to draw Rindon in a hurry like this, and carefully swiveled around until he could draw the sword. Then, of course, he was faced with the problem of how to stay in the tree with a large and heavy bastard blade in one hand. And how was he to get down quickly without falling on the sword? In the end, he sat astride the branch with the sword balanced crosswise in front of him and hoped his enemy had Rhea's eyesight, but not her nose. Peter had been walking, or running, or crawling for many hours by now, with hardly a stop to rest. So it was no surprise when he found himself dozing on the tree, and only woke with a jerk as he began to tip over sideways. Swinging an arm wildly, he righted himself, but just enough to see Rindon slide sideways pommel first. He made a grab for it, but not fast enough, and he was awake enough not to seize the blade with his bare hands. The sword fell, the hilt bouncing off Peter's boot so that it spun forward into the middle of the path. Peter's eyes followed it, and it hit the ground, right in front of a shaggy gray creature which leapt backwards in surprise. "Werewolf!" thought Peter, and then he realized he had overbalanced in his grab for the sword, and he was falling from the tree as well. The next few moments were a jumble. He landed on his shoulder on something that gave under him, and then the rest of his body hit the ground hard. Oof! "Werewolf!" Peter reminded himself and pushed himself up looking for Rindon. There was the blade just a few feet away, and there was the werewolf's face even closer! Peter scrabbled backwards, still on his hands and knees, and the werewolf lunged at him, snapping! He wore no armor. The werewolf's teeth caught at his left shoulder and ripped through cloth and skin as though they were wet paper. The pain was shocking, but Peter couldn't stop moving or he would be dead. He flung himself sideways, rolling, and managed to get his feet under him. There was nothing he could do about his shoulder right now, and Rindon was out of reach 12 feet away, a distance he could cover in 2 strides were it not for the creature in his way. "So this is what a human tastes like," hissed the werewolf in a voice that sounded like meat frying. It made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Thin and weak-blooded, like your lion." It scoffed, and rising up on its hind legs, it leapt forward at him. But now Peter had his dagger in his hand, and he met it, stepping forward, dodging the swinging arms with their dirty claws, and ducking low to drive the stone blade upwards. The werewolf was quicker than he expected, though, and it slipped sideways, so the blade merely scored along its ribs. It was a messy wound, but not a dangerous one. This had to end soon, Peter thought. Blood was flowing freely down his left arm, dripping on the dirt, so he tracked bloody footprints across the ground as he stepped sideways. The werewolf wouldn't let him get any closer to Rindon, though, and instead charging forward again with a savage snarl. Peter couldn't afford to grapple with it. He wasn't nearly strong enough. But he remembered what his father had done once when they were out rambling and a dog had charged them from behind a hedge. And Peter had played a lot of football. His kick took the werewolf hard in the abdomen, so hard he heard ribs crack, and the creature fell backwards with a howl. That was all it took. Peter staggered to Rindon, swept up the blade, and swung around just in time to spit the werewolf on the tip of the sword. It died cursing him, or Aslan, he wasn't sure. Leaving him alone and bloodied in the forest with a shoulder that felt like it had been turned into mince, and a long walk home in the dark. Perhaps he should have waited for Rhea to come back after all. Peter wasn't sure when it was that he heard someone approaching. Except that wasn't right. Someone was approaching, that was for sure, except he wasn't hearing anything. It was more like he felt the footsteps, as though they reverberated softly in his own chest, like a heavy lorry driving past the house. Except it wasn't that either. He had sacrificed his shirt, crouched shocky in the bloody mud next to the werewolf's body as he tore the cloth into strips and tied it roughly around his upper arm. It was wet through almost immediately, but there was nothing for it. Then he had cleaned his sword. Always clean your sword, Peter. Sheathed it and began to walk as evenly as possible down the trail. He'd seen a film once in which a man bitten by a werewolf turned into a werewolf himself. If that were true, surely someone would have mentioned that before the battle with the witch, he tried to reassure himself. Regardless, it was hard to keep the thought out of his mind. It began to rain. If Peter had had the breath, he would have laughed. but it was all he could do to keep moving forward, one step following the other with increasing uncertainty. At some point, it had grown completely dark. He was pretty sure that was a natural phenomenon, and not the result of the fact that he'd lost a great deal of blood. The sound of the rain on the leaves drowned out everything else, everything but the way the pain in his shoulders swelled and faded with his pulse. And yet there was that sense. Someone was coming. He stopped, swaying gently, and considered hiding behind a tree, but the closest tree was 6 or 7 feet away. Clearly too far. Whatever was coming had better be friendly. Perhaps it would be the unicorn he had ridden during the battle. Peter couldn't remember its name right now. The sense of someone approaching grew stronger, and then a voice came out of the darkness. "Oh, King, I came as quickly as I could." Rhea! Oh, thank the lion, it was Rhea! Peter nearly staggered, and then he felt the warmth of the wolf next to him, supporting him as best she could. He couldn't lean on her, but she was there, pushing against him, leading him away from the trail and down towards the creek. "You need water, King. You've lost too much blood." Peter blinked the rain out of his eyes and found himself kneeling at the edge of the water. He was suddenly desperate with thirst and leaned forward, scooping the cold water up with his right hand over and over. When his belly was so full of water he thought he might slosh with it, Rhea shoved her head under his arm, and with her help he levered himself back to his feet. "How far are we?" he managed to ask as she led them back up the bank to the trail. "To Thomas." "An hour, maybe 2, she said gravely. "Your siblings are all there and safe. King Edmund negotiated the agreement with the patrol, and Queen Lucy roused the Dryads, although they are few in this area." Peter nodded. He remembered being very worried about Edmund, but it was hard to hold on to that. His legs were so heavy and his arm hurt. He'd hurt it somehow. Maybe when he fell from the tree. Why had he been in the tree? It was raining. Why were they out in the rain? Shouldn't they be somewhere warm and dry? Mother used to tell stories on wet and stormy nights, because Lucy and Edmund would sometimes be afraid of the wind and thunder. "Tell me something," Peter said, mumbled maybe. "Tell a story." There was a soft snort from his right, and very briefly a warm tongue swiped his hand. They walked for a little while longer, and then Rhea said, "Very well. I will tell you the story of Earl Shandon and the last defense of Carpetbaggers." If you would like to know the story Rhea told, you may read it here, and perhaps you will enjoy it more than Peter did. Peter followed Rhea's voice as she spoke of battles and treachery, murder and sacrifice, leading him on until it seemed as though he had always been walking in the wet and slippery darkness, and always would be. Then suddenly there were new voices and hands touching him, which barely reached through the fog of pain and exhaustion, and he stumbled forward as one of them pulled his good arm across his shoulder and led him into a place of warm brightness. Then followed a period of confusion in which he was seated, and there was more light, and then heat and pain as his clothes were pulled off, and then another voice, shriller, and then finally, blessedly, warm silence as he fell into darkness. The door to the cave was open when Peter awoke, the morning light streaming in across the floor. He blinked at the bright sun and then looked about. He was arrayed on Tumnus's divan, stripped to his underclothes, underneath a deep pile of moth-eaten blankets. He turned his head, cautiously, and then felt at his left shoulder. It didn't hurt, although the skin felt strange. He drew the blankets down and looked. Where yesterday morning there had been smooth pale skin, with a few freckles, there was now a wrinkled mass of scarred flesh the size of his palm just below the point of his shoulder, as though he had been bitten years ago and fully healed. It didn't hurt, and he seemed to have full use of his shoulder. "Lucy's cordial can't fix everything we've learned," said Edmund, handing Peter a cup. "If it's been too long since the injury, I guess it just doesn't work as well." "Well enough, though," said Peter, raising the arm to demonstrate. Edmund smiled, though there was a strain about his eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. "You gave us a scare," he said, and drank some of his tea, staring down at Peter. "What were you thinking going off alone?" "I was thinking we needed the intelligence," protested Peter. "Besides—" But it wasn't fair to blame Susan, so he amended the sentence to, "You were late coming back. I was bored."
giving him a sour stare.
Edmund said, "Part of the point of that exercise was to convince the troll that you were well away from it. Getting yourself jumped and chewed on is not lying low, Peter." "Fine," Peter said and pushed himself to his feet. "Where are my clothes and what happened with the patrol anyway?" His clothes had been hung to dry by the fire and they were still damp, but at least someone had knocked the worst of the mud off them. He struggled into his breeches just in time for Susan and Lucy to come yawning from the inner room. Susan headed for the teapot, while Lucy threw herself at Peter and hugged him hard. "I was so worried," she said, her eyes wide. "You were all grey and floppy. It was frightening." "Well, you fixed me right up," Peter said, hugging her back gratefully. "I'm sorry I scared you." "And you left him a brilliant scar he can impress gals with," noted Edmund, and then
Dr. Lazy swat from Susan.
We're all back now,
Susan noted, dropping into a chair close to the fire.
I think Ray is outside with Tumnus. Lucy, can you call them in? We need to plan for today.
When they had all settled around the hearth and Peter had a bowl of lukewarm rabbit stew to eat, he pointed his spoon at Edmund and demanded, "Talk! What happened yesterday?" "You want the whole story?" "You know what Aureus said," said Peter. "Details are important. Fine." Ed sounded annoyed, but he looked reassuringly relaxed as he poured himself more tea and settled back into his chair. "Tumnus and I got there later than we planned. The White Rush is running high, and it took a while to find a safe place to cross. You'll want to keep an eye on your dwarves, I think. We left Rhea and Lucy in a copse of beeches about midway here, and got to the gates around mid-afternoon. There was a small group of people outside. I think they were waiting for handouts. They all look hungry. I couldn't count without looking obvious, but there were maybe 40 or 50 people inside the castle, all armed in some way. Dwarves, 2 cats, a stag, a couple of otters, some fawns, a horse with an unpronounceable name. Bruno's one of those American bears, a grizzly I think, must be at least 50 stone. Tumnus talked fast at the gate, got us in without any trouble, and the guard took us to meet him in one of the rooms."
Not the throne room?
asked Susan in some surprise. Edmund shook his head. "No, he was in some other room. Looking through crates. There are a lot of crates there." He paused and took one of Tumnus's biscuits, then frowned at it before popping it whole into his mouth. Crumbs fell out of his mouth and Susan rolled her eyes. Tumnus took up the tale while Edmund chewed. "I made the introductions. Bruno knows me, High King, and we have never caused each other trouble, possibly because I have become very good at staying out of his way. He's not well liked in Lantern Waste. He's always been a bully, and for all that he's now claiming to protect his neighbors, he was more willing than most to cooperate with Mulgrim and the secret police. But he received us with some courtesy, and although I think he was skeptical, he was willing to accept King Edmund was who I said he was." "So did he agree with you?" Peter asked. He'd finished his stew and he was still hungry. Susan saw him looking and handed him her biscuits. "Eventually," said Edmund. "He didn't like the idea much, and I think he suspected I was trying to get access to all the goodies he's found in the castle. Not that he's wrong about that. But we got lucky, sort of. While we were there, a messenger arrived, a fox who'd found a small fawn holt burned out up in the western hills. And one of the cats came in and she'd been at the battle, Peter. She recognized me, and more importantly, she told Bruno about how we crushed the witch's forces."
That's a bit of a stretch, isn't it? Susan interjected. You weren't exactly winning when we arrived with Aslan.
Edmund scowled at her and ignored the interruption. Anyway, that seemed to do the trick. The cheetah laid it on pretty thick about our strategic brilliance, and you could see him thinking how useful I could be in taking care of all his competition in the area. And then thinking how easy it would be to take care of one small son of Adam when nobody was paying attention, added Tumnus with unexpected grimness.
Edmund!
Lucy cried, sitting up so fast she spilled her tea.
He wouldn't really, would he?
Even now, after all they'd seen, Lucy was still so much herself. Peter wanted to reassure her, but didn't want to lie to her either. She was, after all, a Queen of Narnia. The silence lingered for a moment, and finally he said, "He might try, but Ed and Sue will look out for one another. And Rhea will be with them. It'll be all right, Lucy." Edmund brushed some crumbs off his tunic. "I'm not going to get killed, Lou. Not even to prove Pete wrong. We can handle Bruno." But Peter thought his voice was a little uncertain, and after all, 50 stone was a very large bear. He decided he would have a private word with Spearfast if she came before he left. Just to make sure. Anyway, Edmund continued, filling his voice with confidence that seemed only mildly forced. Bruno has agreed to ally with us, at least for this. These people are dodgy, but they saw the value of acting against the witch's forces.
Rebels, reminded Lucy, and Edmund grinned.
Exactly. I'm guessing Bruno's smarter than he lets on. He may hold something up his sleeve. And he's got his own intelligence. Even before Thomas introduced us, I got the sense he knew who I was, and he definitely knew we'd come down from the North Reaches.
Peter, it must have been that crow, interrupted Lucy, waving one hand. Then when I saw at Stormcoat's village, I knew there was something strange about it, and I was right. It was eavesdropping on us, and then it must have flown off and told Bruno we were coming.
Tumnus put a hand over his mouth and had a smile. Peter just nodded, his mouth full, and waved a hand at Edmund, who drank some more tea, and continued. Well, there was a crow, so Lucy may be right about that. I didn't recognize him. Anyway, Bruno's had something, so he quizzed me about you, why we had separated, all that. By the way, you and Lou have spent the last few days on your way to Baruna to help with the floods. That's why you're not here, so do me a favor and stay out of sight from now on. Peter didn't reply. Edmund shrugged. He said he would bring his troop to the rendezvous by sunset today, and the rest of the schedule depends on what you learned on your adventure yesterday. Peter put his bowl on the table and poured himself more tea. I got a good look at the rebels' camp. It was pretty big. I'd say they had nearly 100 people there. Ogres, hags, goblins, werewolves. Quite a few dwarves, too. You'll have to watch out for their archery. And harpies. Oh, and some wolves. Rhea stared at that but didn't say anything. There comes... Let me see. He turned back to the table and shuffled through the maps. Here, on the west side of Blackthorn Ridge, just north of an oak grove. Edmund and the others gathered around, and Edmund traced Whiterush Creek with his finger until he hit the point where it curved away west. The map didn't have topographic lines like the ones their Uncle George used on his hiking trips, but it did mark the landmarks like hills and rivers. Here, Peter said, tapping the map. Here's their camp. It's not a bad place for a battle, but it depends on your numbers. If you're outnumbered, I'd rather you draw them to you. Say at this spot here. He pointed to a rise further down the valley. I think the hilltop is clear, but there's a lot of trees on the lower slope. It would serve to break the forces up. How many do we have so far?
Word has spread very rapidly, King Peter, said Tumnus. There is a sizable encampment already at the ford, and more are arriving every hour.
Great, said Peter. Are there many archers?
2 squads of fawn archers who fought with us before, said Susan. You remember Fraxinus and his brothers?
Peter raised his eyebrows. When that squad of fawns had run out of arrows, they had dropped their bows and charged screaming into the melee. They had cut quite a swath through the witch's dwarves, as Peter recalled. How many troops so far, do you think? Edmund shrugged. A few dozen, but like Tumnus said, more are coming in all the time. He turned back to the map. That looks like it would take us about half a day to get that far with the entire force. If we can bring them to battle, it won't be before tomorrow afternoon. Which reminds me, how do you want to split up?
Do we have to? asked Lucy. Split up, I mean.
Susan gave her a look.
You're not going into battle with us, Lou.
Well, said Peter, at least that's not the idea. When Susan glared at him, he shrugged helplessly. We have to get into the castle somehow. I promise I won't leave it unprotected.
I don't need protection, protested Lucy, apparently forgetting that she wanted to be where the danger was.
Susan folded her arms, frowning.
You know, I'm not sure I like this plan. Too many things can go wrong.
Peter looked at her, scowling at the map, and then down at the parchment spread across Tumnus's table. They were just children, he thought, barely able to defend themselves, and they were taking on this enormous challenge. Driving off the rebels, sneaking into a fortified castle. It was madness! But it was what they had to do. Peter sighed and bent over the charts and tried to figure out a way to get a group of soldiers into range of the witch's castle without anyone noticing them.